Next on our agenda, Anti-Discrimination Ordinance discussion. We have Mr. David Bria, councilman from Yardley Borough. Well, I believe Yardley Borough instituted such an ordinance not too long ago, and we'll hand it over to you to explain it to us and tell us what the good and bad are.
All right, yes, that is correct. First, I want to thank the board, Chairperson Calabro, for inviting me here tonight to discuss this. I did email over some materials. Did everyone receive copies of that? Okay. And as you mentioned, Yardley Borough did institute an anti-discrimination ordinance earlier this year. And specifically, it's an ordinance that looks to protect the LGBTQ community from discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodation. And before I get into the details of this ordinance, I would just like to speak a little bit about why this is in front of the Board of Supervisors. When we think of anti-discrimination measures, we usually think of our congresspeople or our state representatives. It's not quite something we expect to appear at this level. And the reason for that is that there's currently no federal law that references sexual orientation or gender identity when it comes to anti-discrimination. Likewise, at the state level, there's no law. There is the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. It closely parallels the protected classes under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but there's no mention of sexual orientation or gender identity. We see nationally that interpretation of that law is split by some of the federal appellate courts. In some districts, sex discrimination is understood and interpreted by the court to cover sexual orientations. In other districts, the decision is completely reversed, where the decision was that if Congress intends to do that, they should pass a law. Some of the remaining districts, there's no decision at all. Likewise, at the state level, as I said, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act does not reference sexual orientation or gender identity. Every year, or every session, I should say, a law does come up in the General Assembly in Pennsylvania. This year and in sessions past, it's been called the PA Fair. It always has bipartisan sponsorship. I believe the session with the most had nearly 100 co-sponsors. There are only 203 representatives in the General Assembly, so that is pretty close. You might be wondering why it hasn't become law. The simple answer is that it is intentionally held in committee every session. It is not allowed to go to the floor. It is not allowed to see a vote. If it were, I'm very confident that it would pass, but unfortunately that is not the decision that's being made in Harrisburg. That is where the board comes in. The Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, that's the existing anti-discrimination law in Pennsylvania, enables municipalities to create their own Human Relations Commission, and that would parallel the system at the state level. But in creating that commission, you could expand the protected classes, and you could complete anti-discrimination legislation, at least here in Newtown Township. Over 50 municipalities in Pennsylvania have done that already, including all of our major cities. Here in Bucks County, there are a total of 5 that have done it. Yardley Borough, where I introduced that ordinance, is the most recent. It's also been passed in Bristol Borough, Doylestown Borough, Newtown Borough, and New Hope Borough. And just an interesting point, if Newtown Township were to adopt this, you would nearly double the number of residents in Bucks County that are protected from discrimination like this, just simply because boroughs are smaller than the township is. Just briefly going through the policy memo that I sent out, I referenced the public opinion on this. There's been a lot of polling about this. This is popular. This is not controversial. As I said, the legislation that's been introduced is always bipartisan. It polls well. It's also something that we see businesses implementing. Remember, Fortune 500 companies have had this policy in place for quite a long time. And the most notable high-profile case of that now is with Amazon, who has been quite open about the fact that they want the location of their second headquarters to be a state that has a complete anti-discrimination law. So we see this as a positive thing for businesses, both big and small. It's certainly something we know companies are looking for when they decide to relocate or to set up somewhere. Continuing, the other piece that is suggested in the ordinance is a ban on the practice of conversion therapy on people under the age of 18. And to be perfectly frank, I think to call it therapy is really quite terrible. But this practice is anything that is meant to change the sexual orientation of a patient. It has been debunked by nearly every professional medical organization in the country. It is also, the practice has been banned in 14 states, including New Jersey, where Governor Christie signed the ban. As I said, I did distribute a copy of the ordinance that we passed in Yardley. It is nearly identical to the ordinances that are passed in most other municipalities. There are some minor changes, notably as the size of the Human Relations Commission that it sets up. In Yardley Borough, we went with 5 members. We were nervous about being able to fill that commission. I'm happy to report we actually had to turn people away for it. So I guess at this time, if any members of the board have any questions, here to answer as best I can.
Any questions for Mr. Bria? Sure.
Yeah, I have a question. Regarding the commission, can you tell me a little more background on that? How does that work in this plan?
Right, so the commission is set up to parallel the system that is in place for the state. So if you currently were to face an issue of discrimination, you lost your job, denied services, anything like that, you would file with this commission, you'd be put on a waiting list, and eventually you would have to drive down to Philadelphia where a board would hear your case. This essentially would set up a commission in Newtown Township that would have the authority to hear those cases if something happened within the township. And that's for all cases of discrimination, not just the 2 classes that I've been speaking about specifically.
And is that like a permanent standing commission? Is that like regular meeting kind of thing, or is it convene when there's an issue? How does that work?
Right, in practice, they convene when there's an issue. In some places, these commissions take a little more active role in advising different activities in the community, but in some places, they just meet as needed.
Okay.
I have a question. These members of the commission, do they have to have certain qualifications? Is there certain background that you're looking for these people?
Right, the ordinance doesn't spell out any specific requirements. Certainly, we want to look for people who are going to have relevant experience, that if they're hearing a case, they're not going to be completely out of their element. The one thing that's standing out to me right now that would be included in our ordinance is that members of the commission may not hold office with any political party.
Okay. And you said they only meet as needed?
Right, they can, correct. If there were a complaint filed, they would have to meet in order to hear that complaint. I think other than that, they're required to probably meet once a year, which is common for most boards and commissions.
Is there any kind of training process that they go through that you know of?
There currently is not any training process set up. However, the Bucks County Human Relations Council, which is similar in name but different from this, they're an advisory body, they are looking into getting these commissions together across Bucks County. As I said, there are currently 5, hopefully there will be more, and setting up some training and guidance for that.
In a Montgomery County borough in which the borough enacted the Human Relations Commission, they required the Human Relations Commission members, once appointed, to undergo training with the State Human Relations Commission, which graciously and gladly offered to provide free training to the members. So the ordinance itself requires all members of a local Human Relations Commission to train with the State Human Relations Commission.
Right, training is certainly important. Just this year with the Supreme Court, there was a pretty high-profile case with the Masterpiece Bake Shop, and the finding there was essentially that one of the members of the commission didn't handle the case properly, and that's obviously somewhere, if there's proper training in place, you don't have that problem.
Yeah, I think if you're doing a commission, I think that's a good idea, to try and get that training.
And we could add that.
Yeah.
That's your question, or?
I was just gonna say, could we add that as one of the sections?
Sure.
And,
Absolutely.
John?
Yes, I've read Governor Wolf had instituted some committee to extend the rights of citizens in terms of their sexual orientation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? How does it relate to what's going on in Harrisburg otherwise?
Right, so I believe what you're referring to, Governor Wolf established a LGBTQ Affairs Commission. It's the first of its kind in the country, but it is strictly advisory. So there are a number of leaders from across the state, from diverse backgrounds. They're essentially there to advise the governor on these issues.
Okay, but they don't work with other municipalities and in an advisory role?
Not yet anyway. They've been set up pretty recently, so I think they're probably still figuring out exactly how far their reach will be. But they are there as a resource. I know a number of the members, so certainly we could call on them if we need some help.
Thank you.
I did have one other question. It does appear that the conversion therapy section is a difference between Yardley's ordinance and Newtown Borough, which I was preparing for the meeting and had downloaded theirs before your email came.
Correct. We passed it in Yardley Borough, and that provision is much less common. I believe there are only 7 or 8 in the state of Pennsylvania that have included that. Like I said, Yardley did it. Doylestown Borough has that in place as well.
Okay.
What would the procedure be if someone wanted to file a complaint? Do they go right to this, do they file a special form that goes to this committee? Since the committee's not in session all the time, or do they go to their attorney and their attorney contacts it? How, are you trying to keep the legalese out of this and make it more of a personal type of thing? Or are there a lot of attorneys that are involved in the process when someone says, oh, I've been discriminated against? And my second question is, how do you, not that there's any kind of guarantee, but how do you separate the abusers of the system that just want to file a complaint for the sake of filing a complaint? Because I'm sure that may happen. Is that also for this committee to decide that this person is really faking it, so to speak, and just filing a complaint because I work with John, but I don't like John, so I'm just going to file a complaint against him? How does that happen? How do they follow up with that?
Right, so if a complaint is filed, I believe the ordinance appoints an officer, essentially, in most towns that's probably the manager, who would receive that application, and then it gets referred to the commission. The ordinance spells out the procedure, what needs to be done. There would be hearings. There's a fact-finding procedure. And yes, the commission would make the determination as to whether or not this was a case where there was discrimination or whether it was a misunderstanding. I think in practice, this idea that frivolous complaints are filed is just not something we tend to see that often, especially around these issues. It's just, certainly someone could do it, but in practice, it's just not something we see.
Is this committee almost like mediators? They could have the two people or the two parties come to some sort of consensus on what's the right thing to do instead of litigation or anything like that? Right,
and in these cases, if an agreement can be reached between the two parties, I think that's often the best outcome. However, if it can't, this can follow a pretty legal process. The commission can essentially do anything the state commission can do, so that could involve awarding damages.
I have another question. Of the municipalities that you mentioned, how many cases have come before those boards?
In Bucks County, as far as I know, we haven't had any. Now, I'll be honest, I don't think that's because these situations don't come up. I think it's because a lot of people don't know that these boards are present, that they're within these municipalities. And the boroughs are quite small, so it's a limited number of people. And in the past, if they had taken it to the state, they may or may not have gotten anywhere with that.
I'm sorry, another question. So this would apply to somebody who lives in Newtown and or works in Newtown, so would either of those get you the, like if we pass it here, those are the two things that would have to apply, either you live here or you work here, to come under our commission?
Right, so the act of discrimination needs to take place within the
Within
township.
Okay.
Mhm.
And I will make note that in response to another question that was asked earlier, that there is a section on conciliation. And it looks like the commission would attempt to resolve the complaint by persuasion, conference, and conciliation.
Right.
So, that was an important way to go.
Mhm.
But if it would be unresolved, then we would go to a higher.
Right, then there are expanded procedures that could go beyond that, and it could get appealed, before a court if it's unable to be resolved here.